we should start with some of the latest NFL developments because the news is encouraging. Yesterday, multiple reports, Paul, that both sides have hammered out an agreement in terms of the medical protocols that they're going to test on a daily basis for the first 2 weeks of camp. And then if the percentage of positive return is below 5%, they'll then scale that back to once every other day. And it looks as if the NFL's latest proposal also means no preseason games, which is one of the criteria that the players have been arguing for. So I think the positive takeaway once again is not only are we inching closer to training camp, but we're inching closer to both groups seem to be finding that common ground.
Well, you know, Lance, I believe, if I didn't say it on BBKL when this whole pandemic thing started back in the middle of March, I certainly felt this way, that the one thing above all else that was going to have to be in place before we had any chance of having an NFL season this year was going to be the testing. And I felt if that was there, then it was going to be awfully difficult to stop this game from going on. And now that we've got a deal together which not only says, okay, they're going to have enough tests because they've got a medical outlet that the NFL has contracted with to provide them with what they believe to be adequate tests and enough of a supply of tests, I think it's full speed ahead. I feel extremely confident now that there will be an NFL season. Now, in what shape or form, what are the dates that everything happens, I still think those things are fluid. I'm not believing anything is in stone or cement, other than I am very, very confident that the Giants and everybody else in the NFL are going to have some football this year.
Well, I'm completely with you. I think my biggest concern was I did not want to see both parties go down that same road as Major League Baseball went, when it seemed as if it became more of a CBA negotiation, Paul, than perhaps just working out the logistics to try to get a season up and running this year. And the fact that it looks like, hopefully, we are going to avoid that. Clearly, there are, in fairness, some economic issues that have to be worked out, but I think that they're certainly moving closer to finding a common ground there. But I think with respect to the testing, and you just alluded to this, the fact that they have hired out a company, one of the biggest priorities for the NFL was that they did not want to take away resources and testing from the local communities, Paul. And I think that's what they emphasized with this latest announcement and these reports, that they have found their own company that's going to deal with the NFL, and that's not going to have anything to do with local hospitals or entities. So the reason why I bring that up is there are a lot of people that point out, well, why do leagues seem to be getting preferential treatment? Well, that should not be brought to the forefront when we're talking about the relationship that the NFL is building with some of these other companies.
Well, I believe all the time, Lance, this goes for every product across the board. There is a consumer pipeline for some products, and then there's also a commercial pipeline for some products. For example, like if you went to buy a laptop computer, there are commercial lines that go through commercial supply lines, and then there are consumer versions of the computer that you're going to find at your local store or on the internet. They are two expressly different supply lines. And unless I misunderstood, the Giants are, as you said, not the Giants, but the NFL, they're not going through the public supply lines for this testing. They are independently going through a commercial supply line and coming up with the necessary funds on their own, because let's face it, the stuff does cost money, to have the laboratory give them what they need to try to get a product on the field.
Lance Meadow, Paul Dottino with you here on Tuesday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live. Now, that's the medical side of things, which is certainly encouraging. As far as on the field is concerned, it looks as if we're going to have a very lengthy ramp-up, Paul, to the start of the season, if the reports are true that there will not be any preseason games. And that means that, once again, those limited opportunities for this Giants coaching staff specifically to evaluate the players, and they may only wind up, Paul, based on the timeline that I've seen, with about 2 weeks of padded practices, because it's important to know, Paul, they're going to get back to the facility, and the first thing is they're not going to throw these guys on the field in live practice situations.
No.
There's going to be a strength and conditioning phase, and then little by little they're going to get on the field. So the reason why I think that's important to bring up, this is where the continuity carryover from 19 versus the teams with new players and new schemes comes into play. I would argue even more, because when you have a preseason game, you could say, well, maybe that helps offset some of the differences. Now, the Giants, like many other teams that have new staffs and a lot of new faces, it's going to be quite the uphill battle with potentially just 2 weeks of padded practices and then straight to your first week game.
Well, the only way that these teams, and we're going to put the Giants in with a boat of about half a dozen other teams that have had significant changes in their coaching staffs. And let's face it, too, the Giants could have as many as 24 new players on their roster as well.
Yeah.
So it's not just coaching staff, it's player and player relationships that are going to be new as well. It seems to me that the best thing that could happen to any of those teams specifically is that there are going to be a controlled scrimmage or two, because they will have, if they can get controlled scrimmages underway, the opportunity to go through a dry run of what the logistics will be on a real NFL game day. And I think that's as important as anything else. Now, I know you're talking more about the physical hitting and some of the things that will physically and mechanically happen on the field. And I accept that. There's no question. That's something that you have to consider. But I also believe just the game day logistics of how teams are going to have protocols and rules to follow, and this is how we do this, and this is how we're going to handle that. That, to me, is something that I know from the very beginning the league was hoping that they would have at least one preseason game, because they wanted everybody to be able to go through a dry run of what a game day would be before they started to make these things count. And so I'm thinking that, we may see a scrimmage or two between some teams that are going to be regionally located, and I think the Giants and Jets obviously make the most sense, just to give everybody a comfort zone for what things could look like on a game day experience.
And I'm with you, Paul. I brought up the physicality of the sport, as you noted, but I was campaigning for at least one preseason game, and I completely understand where the players are coming from. It's not worth the safety risk for a game that doesn't mean much in the standings, but I was putting more value, as you were, with respect to a preseason game this year, maybe more so than previous years, because it's not a matter of you having an opportunity to just evaluate your players. It's also, to your point, evaluating the logistics. Okay, how are we getting into the stadium? What do our players need to get ready for? How much earlier do they maybe need to get to the stadium if there's going to be a long line for them to have their temperature taken or something to that degree? I'm just giving you a hypothetical. Those are things that I think are important for somebody to know what you're doing before you actually get into it. It's no different, Paul, than building the analogy of, can you imagine if a team didn't practice at all and just showed up every Sunday and played a game and hope for the best? The results would be horrendous. That's why they practice every week, right? You get ready and you make sure that you know all the plays. You also make sure that the communication between the coaching staff and the players is in sync. And that's the other aspect that I want to bring up, because I think that's not being covered enough, Paul, with respect to having no preseason games. Let's use the Giants coaching staff. Let's specifically put them under the lens. Jason Garrett is a new coordinator to this team. Don't you think it's valuable that he runs through some game situations with Daniel Jones hearing it in his helmet, so that he knows what to anticipate on game day, and for them to work out the logistics of, we're going to have guys up in the boxes as opposed to on the sideline? See, that's where I think the preseason environment for specifically a new coaching staff is absolutely key, as opposed to Mike Tomlin, for example, and the Steelers staff. They've been through these logistics. It's not the first rodeo for Ben Roethlisberger and some of the personnel around him. For the Giants, though, Paul, very much different dynamics we're talking about.
Look, I'm going to equate this for a second to music, right? Let's say you have two people who are going to want to do a duet, and they can talk all they want about how they're going to sing this particular number, but until they actually get in the studio together and they sing together, that harmony is still hypothetical. You have to be able to work together under live conditions to make everything smooth and to make it run exactly as you want it to run. So for a Daniel Jones and a Jason Garrett to say everything that they want to say to each other about, well, how do we call plays? How are we going to talk about things between times out on the field? Because when the defense is out there, I want to be able to talk to you. Well, okay, you're going to be in the box? Oh, I don't know. You're going to be down on the sideline? No, I don't know. Okay, well, even if we know where you're going to be, how does that conversation take place? Is it more Jones just listens? Is it give and take? What are the attitudes that guys are going to have while they're actually in live game action? Because people react differently in pressure-packed environments when everything is live and for real. And so these are all the types of things that it's important. I could not agree with you more, which is why I was totally 150% on board with having at least one preseason game, and why I am supporting now some type of scrimmage, because these are things you can talk about till you're blue in the face, and I'm not really using a pun there on purpose, but until you actually do it, you don't know specifically how people are going to react or, for that matter, interact. It is a big deal.
I'm completely with you once again. It will be interesting if they do allow teams to hold scrimmages, because that to me is very similar to a joint practice, Paul, which they clearly already outlawed several weeks ago. So if you're not going to have the structure of a preseason game, you're going to allow teams to scrimmage, it's got to be even across the board, because you can't just let one or two teams decide to scrimmage, because to your point, the Giants and the Jets geographically are ideal, where they both can hop on a bus. The Giants could technically walk and go right to MetLife Stadium and hold the scrimmage, but then all of a sudden, team that is in the middle of the country does not have a team within that distance. What are you going to do?
Well, it may
Some
even be
teams
an
have to get on a
intra-squad
plane,
scrimmage,
Paul, to get to a stadium.
Yeah, but it could even be an intra-squad scrimmage, because if you're going to have,
well, that makes sense.
Even if, I'm saying scrimmage because I'm open to any type of scrimmage. It doesn't have to be team against team. It could be a blue and white scrimmage, like the colleges do. So Giants would be a blue and white scrimmage. The Jets would have a green and white scrimmage. If you have to do that, and it's not a real game, but a truncated game, because it's set up with the parameters of how we would run a game day, but you wouldn't necessarily have four quarters. I mean, look at what they did with baseball the other day, right? The Yankees and Mets played a game at Yankee Stadium, and the Yankees were winning 6-0, and the game was technically over, but the Yankees got to bat in the bottom of the ninth, because the managers had already predetermined that they wanted so many guys to get at bats and so many pitchers to get pitches in. So it was kind of like a game, but it really wasn't a game, because they kind of changed the rules a little bit to fit their purposes and what they needed to get out of their players. I think you could probably do that with an inter-squad scrimmage, if necessary. And that, to me, would be a heck of a lot better than doing nothing.
It's just like a spring game in college ball, as you mentioned, where usually they have the teams split up, and it's actually the beginning of the offseason, and fans even sometimes come. Of course, fans wouldn't come to this. And
sure.
Actually, I may be mistaken, but I believe the Jets do exactly what you're talking about on an annual basis, if I'm correct. They always have that green-white game at MetLife Stadium, I believe, on an annual basis. So for them, it really wouldn't be anything new. The difference is, though, if the Giants wind up utilizing MetLife Stadium, I know there's been some whispers and rumors that may happen, because clearly there's more space, which I think would be practical, Paul. They could use the boxes for bigger rooms to have their positional group meetings. If the Giants are utilizing that stadium, then of course they'd have to work that out with the Jets. But I think that any team that is in the vicinity of a stadium, and there are a number of teams that are, I think they should look to use their stadiums, because I think that would give them much more space and much more leeway to try to run camp as smooth as possible.
Well, for example, the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Yeah.
They do things right there, just like the Giants do. That's beautiful for them. To me, that's an advantage. No matter how much experience that your players and coaches have with each other, I do think that being able to work out and to run your operations in your own stadium, not just your practice field, but in your own stadium, has got to be considered a plus right now.
Lance Meadow, Paul Dottino with you here on Tuesday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live. Thanks so much for tuning in. We're focusing on some of the latest NFL news, and according to multiple reports, it seems that both sides have agreed to the medical testing component, that they're going to test the players every day for at least the first 2 weeks of camp, and it looks as if the NFL's latest proposal has met the condition that the players wanted, no preseason games. But that also brings up challenges in terms of the logistics as well as the physical component to get ready for the season.